Hi. Sorry. Can you not hear? Can you hear now? Excellent. Sorry, that was a sort of slow run up to the, what would be the metaphor in cricket, I don't know, slow run up to the wicket. Anyway, here we are, and it's great to see so many people here this morning, and I'm thrilled to be at the Oxford Real Farming Conference. And I'm triply thrilled to have the panel that we've got with us this morning. John Gummer, Lord Deben, who was until recently the absolutely magnificent chair of the Climate Change Committee, is joining us from a flooded area. As I realised coming into Oxford, you can't even get round parts of Oxford. Certainly, if this is not climate change, well, what the hell is to the government? John will be joining us online, and as yet they have not named his successor. It has been 18 months, I think, and that seems an appalling dereliction of duty, which you might comment on later, but we'll wait to come to it. And our other two speakers on the subject of farming and the importance of farming both to the environment, biodiversity and carbon emissions are the wonderful Chris Smaje, who is an expert on small farming. He has a small farm outside Frome, which is in Somerset, and he has written copiously on the subject of how to improve farming, how to look at alternative foods, and particularly how to establish local food chains, which is, if we're going to do it, really important. And our last speaker, Carl Lischak, comes from Client Earth. Client Earth, for anyone who doesn't know, is the awesome NGO that was set up by James Thornton, an American, to just literally use the law to change the system. And they have done magnificent things with clean air laws and preservations of forests and all manner of things over the years. And Carl's speciality within the organisation is looking at agriculture and particularly how subsidies work. So we're going to kick off today, and there'll be lots of time for your questions. And again, we are taking questions online, so please send them in if you're not able to be here in the room, although I rather envy anyone who is in the room because the atmosphere is great. Please send them in, and we'll come to them after about 45, 50 minutes. So I'm going to just ask each of our panelists to talk about why farming is such a mess at the moment. What's going wrong in the big areas? And I'll start with Chris. Chris, welcome here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Maybe the best way of answering that is to talk about farming systems that aren't such a mess. I mean, most parts of the world have developed local agroecological, mostly mixed farming systems, which tend to be low energy input, sort of input cycling, productive of food and fertility locally of energy. And I think the problem is that they have been broken apart really by the availability of cheap fossil energy, and also as part of that, that generates, there's a sort of strong association between energy availability and capital availability. So that kind of breaks apart the self-limiting local sort of careful husbandry of producing food and fibre and forestry products locally, and kind of extracts, every part of the world then is forced into this kind of race to the bottom of comparative advantage to produce, what it's most advantageously able to produce to sell into global commodity markets, and that has this extractive effect. And I mean, that's been associated historically with removal of labour from the land. So, instead of job-rich local agricultures, we now have capital and machinery-intensive, energy-intensive agricultures, overproduction of commodity crops that are responsive to that. And I think that overproduction is a really key issue, that 75% of global cropland is devoted to just 10 crops, mostly cereals and grain legumes. Whereas traditional local agricultures have that kind of self-limiting dynamic of producing food for local need, what the logic of the kind of energy, fossil energy enriched system, is to produce as much as possible and to sort of extract, it's about net present value rather than local food needs. So really, it's driven by cheap fossil energy, which perhaps is a lead-in to the wider topic today of transforming and transitioning the energy system. But to my mind, it's got to be lower energy, and that then and sort of local input cycling, and not that kind of extractive, drawing out farming into global commodity markets, and that then enables us to look to producing, for local needs for food and fibre, and bringing jobs back into agriculture, and having job-rich local agricultures rather than using the agrochemicals and the high capital, high mechanical farming, which that is what is causing so much of the mess, the biodiversity decline, the kind of terraforming of agricultural landscapes to fit, to kind of large-scale industrial farming. So, yeah, that would be my opening gambit.
So we're going to come on to talk about things like the need for a land strategy, and again, of course, local supply chains. But, John, can we come to you now to talk about what the carbon impacts of farming and agriculture are in terms of our now probably losing bid to stick within 1.5 degrees? I mean, agriculture, it seems to me extraordinary that given how much carbon it produced, it has never been in the international debate about limiting emissions. I know it sneaked in at the COP last year, but it still seems to me to be very downplayed.
Well, yes, and I think the first thing we have to say about it is that here we come to the heart of net zero, because net and zero are both equally important. Net, because that's what we have to remember. We have made it more difficult for the world, the earth and the seas, to take in the carbon which we emit. And after we're already losing carbon, your large audience is causing a great deal of carbon. And I feel very sorry for the cow, because we always blame the cow and never think of ourselves. The truth is that all life means emission. And what has happened is that the earth and the sea has been able to cope with that because it's sequestered the emissions which we produce. And what we've done is to increase the problem on both sides. We have increased the emission beyond anything that the world and the seas could actually astray, but at the same time, we've made the sea and the soil less able to do their job. And farming, of course, the way we do it, has been at the heart of it. So, first of all, deforestation in order to be able to grow crops, then to grow crops without reinforcing the biomass and by reducing fertility, by using the shortcut of chemicals. And then, of course, at the same time, we have to remember the same thing is happening in the seas, so that we have bottom which destroys the basis of both carbon sequestration and of stopping that turning into an emission. And so what we have is to a double problem. And in peatland, we are repeating what we do in the sea. In the peatland, which ought to be great area of deforestation. The peatlands are now so distorted in so many parts of the world that they are in fact the source of emission rather than the place where emissions are reduced. So farming, absolutely central. And at the same time, we have been allowing the agricultural industry to reduce our biodiversity and to undermine the kind of mix of plant and of the animal and insect kingdom which keeps the balance right. So you have to think of your driving your motor car today and compare it with 40 years ago. 40 years ago, when I drove from my home in Suffolk, I'd have to clean the windscreen when I got here because it was splattered with insects. I now don't have to do that because we have lost so much of the insect population, all of which do part of the job of keeping the balance between emissions and deforestation. So for me, regenerative farming is absolutely central to the future battle against climate change. And I do have to say to you, Rosie, I'm not prepared to say that we are going to give up on 1.5. And there are two reasons for that. One is if we do, then it won't be 1.5, it won't even be 2. It'll be much worse than that. And secondly, we must concentrate people's mind on understanding that 1.5 is absolutely necessary for a world which is livable in the way we mean to live today. If we let it go beyond that, we are creating a world which will be almost impossible for large numbers of people to live.
John, thank you very much. I'm going to come to Kyle next, but when I come back to you, I want to just get your view on what good or not good the Agriculture Day at COP achieved last year, as it was indeed the first Agriculture Day. But I'm going to ask Kyle now to pick up. I mean, you used the word we've been making shortcuts across how we farm, shortcuts in terms of fertilizers, pesticides, trashing through rainforest, and the shortcuts have a lot to do with how subsidies work, how governments work, how the big food companies work, which is what you do.
Thanks, Rosie. Well,
before you move to that,
okay. Sorry, you've now disappeared from my screen. Hello, yes, hello.
Could somebody tell me how I can stop the echo that I get when I speak?
This is definitely above my pay grade. Have we got a tech person here who could answer the question? Maybe someone could pick this up by phone with you. Possible?
Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
okay, thank you, Rosie. Well, I'll start by just talking to you a little bit about what I think the formula is, certainly in this country, and it could be expanded out globally for getting this right. Now, you know that we are operating in this context to achieve targets. These targets in the UK are statutory targets. So we have the climate net zero target, which comes out of the Climate Change Act. And in fairness, the UK was a global leader in terms of, at that time in 2008, passing primary legislation to achieve net zero. So that's there, and we're still working towards it. The other one that's come out more recently, which integrates with that, is the Environment Act 2021, which has important statutory targets in it for biodiversity, water quality, and other things. Now, how do you reach these targets in a legal system? Well, there's different ways of doing it, but two themes continuously come up. Those are carrots and sticks, they're sometimes called. So let's take regulation to start with. The NGOs that I work with, particularly in the agriculture sector, hold in very high regard the principle that you need to protect the assets, the environmental assets that are currently there through regulation. And that includes things like soil, which I'll come back to, which is very important for a number of reasons, including carbon sequestration. So there's good regulation that's not only there, but is used, is enforced properly, fairly and proportionately. Then there are incentives, or sometimes they're called subsidies. And this country is now in a major transition away from the European Common Agricultural Policy into a new national system, which you'll know as ELMS, which includes the Sustainable Farming Incentive and other components. Getting that right to add a layer above protection of existing assets, which is rather the restoration and improvement of environmental assets, is important. These things need to be run in a coordinated and integrated way to add up the math to get to the targets, or to help to get to the targets. Obviously, there's other things in other sectors that are important for these targets as well. So there's the quantification part. There's also the spatial part, and I hope we come back to the land use framework for England later in this conversation, because looking at this from a high level across the country, how these things are implemented, where they go, where's the best place to do certain things, and how that all knits together from a geographical perspective is very interesting as well. I'll just give you I'll go back to regulation and the regulatory baseline first, and just give you a couple of examples of the kinds of things that have happened recently that aren't so good for achieving climate and other targets. So one of them is something that we work on at Klein Earth. We brought a complaint in the autumn of 2023 to the Office of Environmental Protection on pesticides. So this is about neonicotinoid use in East Anglia for sugar beet. These pesticides are now banned in the European Union, right? But they continue to be used in this country on an emergency authorization basis. Now, what's the problem with these pesticides, going back to Lord Deben's comments about insects, is that they severely affect the behavioral patterns of honeybees and other invertebrates, which of course have links to both agricultural and wild plant productivity systems. We say the government didn't get it right when it introduced legislation to allow these emergency authorizations. One example of where things have fallen behind a little bit in the wrong direction, I say, on regulation. There's other examples. Klein Earth was involved with other stakeholders this year in campaigning for, you might remember, the Retained EU Law Bill, which is now the Retained EU Law Act. Fortunately, that was scaled back through the advocacy from ourselves and many other sources. It was announced last May that all of the retained EU law, much of which relates to the protection of the environment and helps with these climate issues, all of that law was going to go as of the 31st of December last week. Luckily, the list of things that are no longer with us from a retained law perspective is much, much shorter. And many of the things that are very important for progress in our area that we're talking about, like the habitats regulations, and many regulations that apply to agriculture, are still with us. I suppose the one I really want to talk about here today, which just happened this week, January 1st, is the removal of what's called, many of you might be familiar with it, what's called cross-compliance from the landscape. Now, you'll know that historically within the European CAP program, something called the basic farm payment or the single farm payment was applied to agricultural land as an incentive or a subsidy based on the number of acres owned of land. That's changed now, and you know, the consensus, I think, largely in the agricultural NGO sector is it's a good thing that we're moving away from a basic farm or a single farm payment based on acreage to a new public value for money approach for things that are promoting environmental protection under ELMS. The theory is good. So the problem is not with the shift in how the payment works. It's with the fact that all of those basic farm payments and other payments were subject to cross-compliance, which set out a series of standards across farmland that received these payments that protected assets like hedgerows, like watercourses, like soil. Soil and hedgerows being very good examples of things that help mitigate climate impacts. As of January, that secondary legislation relatively quietly went through in 2023. As of January 1st, basic payment is now decoupled, is reduced, it's decoupled from agricultural land. Cross-compliance is gone. And what do we have left to rely on right now? The uptake of ELMS and SF, including SFI. And where are we with that? As of the middle of December, the uptake rate, as I understand it, for SFI, in other words, agreements that are in place with farmers, is 2.5% of farmers. Now, we have to compare that to the fact that cross-compliance and these measures were in place on 100% of farms receiving incentives not so long ago. And what makes it worse? The fact that an environmental impact assessment was never conducted on the agricultural transition plan in England or these regulations. So this transformation across an enormous landscape of millions of hectares that was subject to strict scrutiny of these cross-compliance standards under the supervision of DEFRA and the RPA, now gone, no environmental assessment conducted for England. Why? Who knows? One was done in Northern Ireland for their agricultural transition program, to their credit. One was done for England for the 2014 to 21 rural development program under the CAP process. Why hasn't it been done now? Who knows? But we say it should have been done. So that is a step backwards.
Okay.
I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, okay, Carl, thank you. I mean, that's, before I come back to John, now that you've raised the whole thing about the end of the cross-compliance stuff, how does that going to affect you?
How is it going to affect me as a smallholder?
Well, maybe you and local farmers near you and the farmers that you talk to. That was a very shattering statistic. I didn't actually realise it was only 2.5% that had properly got signed up by the end of last year. I thought it was slightly more.
I mean, both the joy and the horror of being a smallholder on 18 acres is that the whole of the kind of policy framework around around farm subsidies is way over my head. Yeah, so I mean, it's not going to affect us at all. You know, we're horticulturalists, and that, you know, I mean, that I guess is a really key point to make, is that you know. Well, as I said earlier, you know, farming has gone very much in this direction of a small number of big commodity crops. The future has got to be in horticulture, gardening, growing, diversity, and there's no real. I mean, there was the horticultural strategy that sort of that wasn't. But yeah, you know, we need to be. We need to be focusing more on horticulture and more on mobilising local communities around, around taking care of local food needs. So, you know, I mean, Carl is the expert on this bigger policy framework, but, you know, it's not really affecting my world or the world of small-scale horticulture.
But it is going to affect a lot of relatively small farms, this. I mean, when you start to talk about 100 to 200 acres, I mean, the fact that they are now decoupled from basic farm payments and have to do the complicated business of signing up to ELMS, which, whatever the government and DEFRA says, is complicated. At the moment, you still have to pay to have your soil standards monitored. It's not free. Talk me through how you see that will affect the smaller farmer.
Well,
not the smallholder, but the smaller farmer.
Yeah, I mean, Kyle can probably give a better account of that than me. I mean, I think one of the problems is there is a kind of missing middle in farming, really.
Okay.
There are smallholders and horticulturalists like me, and then there are much bigger scale farmers who are part of this. We have this kind of crazy economic system where farmers are producing, the price of agricultural products is kind of less than the cost of production, and then we have this enormous bureaucratic infrastructure that sort of keeps farmers afloat. But as I say, the model that I have followed is just to sort of keep below that radar and to focus on much more on sort of community mobilisation and on horticulture, and that there really isn't there is where I live in Somerset, there is kind of relatively small scale family dairy farming that's kind of hanging on by the skin of its teeth, but that's really been squeezed, and that's what we need to recreate, that missing middle, really. That would be my take on it.
John, do you see the point about recreating the missing middle? When you get up against the agricultural powers that be, they tend to be colossal and world-dominating and not really caring about, and definitely not the small farmer, let alone the missing middle. I mean, what happened at COP in the way that they tried to address agriculture?
Well, I think for the first time, we've actually got a system which is beginning to take agriculture seriously. I don't think we should underestimate the importance of that. Mm-hmm. And the reason we haven't had it before is simply because of the curious structure of the United Nations. The COP doesn't deal technically with aviation, shipping or agriculture. That's other bits of the United Nations. So gradually the COP has taken over the fact that it's actually got to deal with aviation and shipping, and now it's beginning to understand that you can't leave to the Food and Agriculture Organization dealing with agriculture, because it is so central to meeting our COP demands. So I take very great heart from this, because you have to start somewhere. It hasn't happened before. It's now on the agenda. People will have to report on it. We will get better each year, and we'll have to pressurize it very hard. But that is, in fact, what we are now allowing ourselves to do, which we have not done up to now. So I don't want to underestimate the importance, but there's a great deal more to be done. And when you talk about the missing middle, I think one has to recognize just how enormously lacking in transparency the whole system is. There are 4 major companies which control a huge proportion of the world's food systems. And of those, 2 are privately owned. So we don't know anything like as much as we ought to know about, for example, what Cargill does, because it is not bound to produce the kind of information which publicly owned companies have. So there are real issues which we've got to get right. Secondly, the way to do that is to stick to your guns. I am not at all pleased with the abolition of cross-compliance. It always was crucially important. It was attacked by farming organisations because it did mean that people had to take a whole range of issues much more seriously than they did. Removing it means that agriculture doesn't see these things holistically any longer, but takes particular bits and deals with those and removes itself, therefore, from thinking of the whole picture. That's really serious. But just as serious is the way that this government has gone back on its commitments on international trade. Because in order desperately to pretend that leaving the European Union was a good thing, they've had to sign up to trade agreements with countries which do not protect the standards which we have in Britain. The deal with Australia and New Zealand, the deals that are being undertaken now, are entirely unacceptable. We cannot expect our farmers to meet high standards and tell them that they're going to be subject to competition from countries that don't meet those standards. The government promised that they would protect that. They have not done it. And I want to see that change as a matter of urgency. International trade should be upholding those standards, not undermining them.
Well, John, I hope I can count on your support next Tuesday, because we've got the amendments both for the CPTTPP, however you say it, the Canadian Pacific Trade. I have one on deforestation, and Cathy Willis and I have one on pesticides. The pesticide list that is permitted under this trade agreement we are about to enter into, which is worth only 0.03% of our GDP, allows anything in the world to come into this country. All the things that the EU have fought against and all the things that we still don't do. So Tuesday around 4 o'clock. Okay.
It just reminds you again how important the House of Lords is drawing these attentions, because in the House of Commons they don't have the opportunity to do what we have to do, which is to deal with these acts and bills and trading agreements point by point and clause by clause.
Chris, coming back to you about, John's made the point that we have 4 huge companies, which are the ones that are really on a big scheme trashing the planet, taking down the rainforests, etc., and bottom trawling the oceans. How can we, as a small nation, fight against that? And can we... How can we... their argument, and I do a lot about the ill effects of, we're doing a Lord's Commission at the moment, we're just about to begin on the health effects of ultra-processed food. And you look at the ultra-processed food chains, and most of the stuff is coming from palm oil, it's coming from soy, it's coming from stuff that is grown incredibly cheaply anywhere in the world, broken up, blah, blah, blah. The argument is always put out, people want this, gives them cheap food. I think we all in this room would probably agree that that's wrong, but it's a very hard argument to get your head round. Although I know, as I help work with Feeding Britain, and we have a lot of social supermarkets, and we know the moment we put the fruit and the veg and the fresh stuff into the supermarkets, they're the first off the shelves. They're always the first off the shelves, absolutely regardless of what income or what part of the country we're in. So I know, you know in your heart it's a kind of lie that you're fed, but we are fed this big lie, and it's a very difficult one to get round. And you, as a sort of champion with horticulture, and I know there's been a new report on horticulture that I have to confess I haven't read every word of it, but how do we make that much more, at least here, and then stop people, in a sense, being maybe so reliant?
Yeah, it's very difficult, and that, there's a sort of really intractable set of issues about the combination of the price of housing and land and energy that sort of tends to drive this cheap food and therefore ultra-processed food and the likes of Cargill and so on. I guess, the way I approach things is kind of renewal from the local, from the community. I think, Lord Deben is right that if we don't hit 1.5, a lot of things are going to start falling apart. But, it has to be said that currently there is no transition to net zero. Last year, globally, we used more energy than ever before. 80% of primary energy use globally is still fossil fuel-based, almost as much in the UK. So, I think the way this is going to manifest is in terms of all sorts of sort of crises and chaos in the food supply chain and in the broader politics, and people are going to have to pick up the pieces locally. I think my next book is probably going to be about this, so I'm sort of I'm more in listening mode. I'm interested to hear people's own views about that, and then hopefully I can pass it off as my own ideas in the
Well, we're going to give you plenty of time to hear from the audience, but I still want to get your ideas first.
But yesterday I went to a couple of interesting sessions on commoning and on land ownership, and I think these are really key issues that, there is as a consequence of cheap energy and the flow of capital around the world, we have this huge liquidity in the global economy, that manifests in land values, that puts land values beyond the reach of ordinary people. So I'm very interested partly in these ideas of commoning, but I also want to sort of reinvigorate an old British idea of distributism. So that's basically commons and guilds, but also the right of local people and local communities to access local land and to appropriate food from it. I mean, one thing that we've done that has been interesting with our little local veg box scheme is set up a solidarity box. So most of our customers are the sort of predictable, relatively wealthy, middle class customers, but we set up a system whereby they pay more for their veg box, and that enables us to sell veg boxes at a lower price to people who self-report as being on a lower income. And I think there's sort of interesting issues about local solidarity around that, and that's where I see the real renewal coming from. It's not going to come from the centre or from the corporate sector. I think it's going to come from the crises in the system that are going to force people locally to start sort of thinking about the provenance of their own food and the possibilities of their own locales to produce food. So that's what I want to amplify, really.
That's really interesting. I mean, Carl, we all touched briefly on the need for a land strategy. Can you say what that would be and how you would implement it? I know there's a lot of work going on at the moment around this.
But hopefully, yeah. I mean, I think it was due for publication, at least the first round in 2023. I'm not sure we've seen it yet.
No. No surprise there.
The land use framework and strategy for England, which is, as I understand it, meaning to cover the kinds of ways that we use land in the country that goes beyond the traditional planning system, housing development and other forms of infrastructure development, etc. This is about things that we're talking about right now, including how incentives are used to guide what land is used for. But it's not as... I think what's exciting about it, if it was done properly, there's always a danger that these things get a lot of attention and then they end up on a shelf somewhere and they're not very effective. But if it was done properly, there could be a geospatial element to how incentives work, which I think is fascinating. And it could be, something that's not only in the ag sector, but in the renewable sector as well. And what I mean by that is there are different parts of the country that may be suitable for different sorts of things. So when people talk about, let's say, rewilding, which is a controversial topic, which requires afforestation at some high level, well, perhaps there's parts of the uplands that are more suitable for that. And perhaps there's parts of the lowlands that are more suitable for food security and food production. I mean, people could argue both ways, but I'm just giving an example. Incentives like under ELMS could be targeted to places where they're going to make the best difference. And that could be done in a very efficient and effective way, rather than, the current ELM system has been described as pick and mix. Do a little bit of this, do a little bit of that. My farm's going to have a corner of wild bird seed and one wind turbine and, something else on the list. And we're going to do that everywhere all at once. Well, maybe that's not the best way to do it. Maybe the way to get to these carbon targets and these biodiversity targets is to think about it from a geospatial point of view. and making people, making most people happy at this, hopefully, at the same time. This is not a radical sort of directive thing. Nobody's required to do anything under this approach. But if finances can flow to the right places for the right things, then perhaps most people and the environment win.
I think it's a pretty difficult one to execute. John, what do you think about the benefits and possible ways that a land strategy could help us? And I mean, I find I always have a problem. It's like abolishing the royal family. I can't actually imagine the day when the removal trucks go down Whitehall. The sort of sense of how you would really radically change the way we use land. I mean, are you telling people to move? Are you telling people to change this, change that?
No, I think, first of all, I've been campaigning for some time to have a ministerial change. What we need is a Department of Land Use. And you would put together planning and agriculture and the environment in a department which actually had the powers to see that the land was used as effectively as possible. That's the first thing. You need a context in which land decisions are made. This is not a matter of revolution, but what it is a matter of is, for example, saying that no planning decision should be made which has not taken fully into account the commitment of the United Kingdom to its targets for net zero by 2050 and its targets for 2030 and 2035. Now, that would change the way that people look at the land, and they would begin to think about what does this mean as far as sequestration is concerned? What does this mean about biodiversity? What does this mean about excluding other uses of the land which might be better? It might start thinking about, for example, the fact that cities and civilization are about living close together, not the suburban life that we have created. The way in which the government has rubbished the concept of the quarter of an hour city, where you are within quarter of an hour of walking to all the things that you want, and try to turn that in a rather sort of American way of finding a conspiracy about it, as if we want to keep people within that quarter of an hour. What we want to do is to make sure that people have the amenities that they need within walking distance. Now, if you're going to do that, it does mean having a much denser way of rebuilding our cities. And some of the most beautiful architecture in Britain, like the Great Crescent at Bath, are very dense in the way in which they provide for accommodation. There are so many changes that we need to make, of which agriculture is only one part. And the trouble with the whole concept of a land use document produced by DEFRA is that it is bound to be thought of as a means of corralling and changing agriculture. Whereas what we ought to be thinking about is, how does a nation deal with perhaps the scarcest thing it's got, which is its land? How does it protect the land that it needs to protect? And how does it exploit properly the land that needs to be exploited? That means you have to have a proper policy. And I think that means you've got to have a department committed to that, which has the powers to say to other people, I'm sorry, you can't do that because the land use policy does not allow it. And until we have that, we're not going to get the kind of judgments we need to have.
Chris, you talked also about a land use strategy, and obviously, from a point of view of localism, lots of things need to be put back, whether it's abattoirs, food chains. What do you want to see from a government coming, let's hope, Labour government before the end of this year? What do you want to see them do that would start to promote the middle, the local food networks? I mean, I agree with you, it's going to come locally, but it's got to get cracking.
I'm always asked this question, and I relapse into silence because I just can't really see. yeah, the governments are driven by. I agree with everything that Lord Deben and Kyle have said about, better land use planning, thinking, putting agriculture into the bigger context, thinking about land use, urbanism and less suburbanism and so on. But I mean, ultimately, I come back to the fact that, we've talked about all of these drivers, the trade deals, the lack of transparency in global food supply chains, the constant emphasis on economic growth, the deep dependence on fossil fuels. I mean, it's relatively easy for me to say, what do I think a government should do? They should slap an enormous carbon tax on fossil fuels. It's interesting. In fact, in the report, the rapid evidence review is sort of interesting in that it has lots of interesting things to say about the emissions of different aspects of agroecological practice, which is sort of good to know. But what it says in the report, 11% of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK derive from agriculture. To some extent, that is undergirded by by those changes in agricultural practice that you asked me at the beginning. But there's more emissions associated with private cars than with the whole of agriculture, and yet you can still just go to a garage and buy petrol or diesel, no questions asked. So, it's easy to, we should have sort of land value tax. We need to, take the capital out of land values, distribute access to land. There's any number of policies, but they're not really going to happen, I think, within the existing framing of politics, which is why I've argued for, renewal, renewal from the margins, an emphasis on local communities, as these various disorders proliferate. I think people are going to have to pick up that slack, and that's where I think the energy and the dynamism is. So that the more that government can help that, and obviously, things like planning frameworks are really significant. But it's essentially government as helpmate to local communities. Actually taking local responsibility for their basic livelihood. But the whole, that whole structuring of global capital, global energy, really militates against that.
It really does. And I find, I tried for a long time, and we'll try again, about right to grow amendments, so that we could do like incredible edible and capital growth in every town.
Pressure your council to have an allotment.
No, it wasn't about
space.
allotments. It was about growing spaces on meanwhile leases, which is so much easier for a council to accept. But we got that turned down, the Tories, with no real good reasons. Before we come to all of you, which we'll do in a minute, I just, the whole sort of new foods, foods made by fermentation or lab-grown meat, what do you think? If we get to a point where, the flooding at the moment is going to really affect spring wheat, all sorts of things, just here around us, within a few miles of where we're sitting. Will the squeeze on that become very strong? And the money's obviously moving in that direction. Do you see any good coming out of it, Kyle? Or is it just going to be another reason for the Mad Brothers Cargill in North Dakota to get even bigger?
You're talking about manufacturing food?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If in fact the growing spaces of the world, Oxford, become less and less because of the weather.
There are some interesting. That's one of the more difficult ones, I think, to bring around a change on. But it's certainly required from a carbon point of view. We're talking about cultural change there in terms of how people perceive the food that they eat, which is a pretty enormous thing to take on. I think, however, that we also have to think about the fabric of the landscape in this country and how that relates to the biodiversity in the country, in addition to the issues around carbon, because much of the biodiversity in the country has grown up around a history of agriculture of one form or another. So agriculture at some level to preserve the biodiversity and enhance it needs to remain on the landscape. However, going in the other direction, we have opportunities now post-Brexit on subsidy control. I think there's some new legislation on that, some freedoms around where public support for policy turns into law that promotes research, development, and growth in certain industries. And if that sentiment is there for this issue of manufactured food off of the land, let's say, that's perhaps more nutritious and better for the environment in certain ways. Insect protein is a fascinating one. Then the legal system can allow for the public interest in that to result in support for those industries. So that could be one way to use the new subsidy control freedoms to get there.
What do you think, Chris?
Well, I've written a book called Saying No to a Farm-Free Future, so I guess my views are probably fairly clear.
That's clear, but go on.
But I mean, I guess one thing I want to say about it in terms of these sort of issues about energy and greenhouse gas emissions and so on is, I mean, I think a lot of people haven't quite got their head around how the main type of manufactured food that is being amplified at the moment is bacterial protein largely. So it's produced in bioreactors using electrical energy. Okay, so I think it's really problematic in the sense that we have to decarbonize the global energy system. Farming is basically the only major sector where it is fundamentally energized by a free zero carbon source, namely the sun. Yep. So that the argument behind so-called precision fermentation is to use a hydrogen oxygenating bacteria that is fed electrical energy, or you basically split water into hydrogen and oxygen, feed the hydrogen to the bacteria, and then get your bacterial protein out of it. But that is tremendously energy costly. So rather than using solar energy, we're using the primary energy to energize that process. So if you think there is going to be a source of energy, a source of low carbon energy, probably orders of magnitude beyond what we currently have. I mean, some of the figures I conjured with in the book, it's about 50 to possibly more than 100 times energy costly than producing protein through growing beans, basically. And I mean, already there's people who are sort of in the manufactured food field who are now moving into using black-eyed beans as the feedstock. So I think just in energetic terms, it's a non-starter, and obviously, it's a kind of a little bit of a cutting-edge biotech thing that, people are trying to draw in public funding for it. There may be a place for it in certain places. I mean, Scandinavia is the place that has been really pushing it, and or some of the cutting-edge development has been done. They have a lot of low-carbon hydro energy and not a great deal of farmland. So, it maybe will sort of fit in certain contexts. But I think it's a non-starter energetically as a mass global food source in the context of having to decarbonise the energy system. And we're not even doing that at present, let alone replacing the sun with primary energy. So I'm not a fan, basically.
I get that.
Can I just suggest that one of the things we've really got to recognise is that we need to make the present system work. If we hang about trying to wait for some perfect system, some redistributive system, some kind of way in which we will meet the world's needs because we have totally changed the way that the world is governed, then climate change will defeat us. System change is not going to come, even if you want it, it's not going to come quickly enough to deliver what we have to do. We have to make the present system work, and we have to make it at every level. So what we've just been talking about in terms of new ways of producing food and such like, that'll have to go on, but not at the expense of doing all the other things we have to do. And one of the problems is that once you give politicians an excuse to say we don't need to do all these things because something else will turn up, then they won't do what is necessary now in the present system. And that's why, for example, the hydrogen economy is such a danger. Hydrogen will play a bit in it, but the idea that you can not do all the other things because somehow or other we'll have a world which can be driven by hydrogen is exactly what George W. Bush believed in. And it's what the Republicans in the United States give their faith into, which is that something will turn up. Now, something isn't going to turn up, and if it does turn up, that will be one more thing in the whole series of things that we have to do. And I'm very down to earth about it. I mean, it is everything. I've just started our local pub again in our village, which means that people can actually eat and converse and spend time in their own village and don't have to get into a car to go somewhere else. That changes the emission pattern in a small village, well, quite a big village really, and in quite a big village, rather importantly. It's only a tiny thing, but if we were all doing all those things, instead of saying we're waiting for the great big thing to happen, then we would have a real chance of meeting 1.5. But unless we do everything at every point and use the system absolutely unmercifully to deliver what we have to do, then we're not going to achieve it.
I wish you were still in your job. It's really sad that you're not there anymore. Right, we've got half an hour left, so let's have Satish in the front row, and then I'll come to the third row. And comments or questions, and...
Okay, good.
There you go.
There are two problems I see in Chris's presentation. One is a loss of skills. People don't know how to grow food. The horticultural ideal that you want, people don't know. So I think every school should have a garden. The children start to learn how to be horticulturist or a gardener and grower. So how to bring skills back? Because we have lost in our cities particularly. People know the skills of computers and all the technology and driving cars and everything, but they don't know how to grow food. So that's how do you bring skills back? Secondly, you say about communities, local communities. There are not many local communities left. New York, Mumbai, Shanghai, Beijing, Tokyo, London, Paris, Berlin. Where are communities? There are no communities. So people don't have skills and they have communities. So how are you going to create this local community? It's the ideal you have, but there are no local communities. People are living in the big cities and they just want to go to supermarket and buy their food. How are we going to create local communities back? These are the two questions.
Well, I think that John answered one of them by saying he started his local pub. And I can answer another one by saying when I ran the London Food Board, along with Sustain ran an incredible project called Capital Growth in London, and we created 2012, it's now 2020, 2,050, 2,500 community gardens in London, and they're all thriving. They are zero cost to the taxpayer, and they form local communities within cities. And I think that John's message that we have to do everything all at once, that you cannot wait for rescue. And I think that inertia in politicians is absolutely true, that we don't worry because we'll make food, we'll grow shrimps in vats that can be stacked up on top of each other, or whatever it is. And it's a very scary moment food-wise, because it's a great opportunity for big food companies to arrive on the government's door and say, hey, we've got a solution, it's low carbon, it's cheap and possibly healthy. I don't know, what do you think, Chris?
Well, in answer to Satish's two questions, I mean, yeah, they're both great questions. Loss of skills, absolutely. I mean, it's a huge problem, and I mean, we've got a great little initiative run by forest school teachers on our land, Shared Earth Learning, and they get funding from local authorities, but it's basically naughty kids who are, getting in trouble for being stuck in the classroom all day, who get to come out and experience being on the land and generally have a great time. So, and learn a few things about growing. But yeah, so I completely agree. Education is a key thing. But what I would say there is that there is this kind of myth that nobody wants to farm anymore. It's a very professionalized, skilled thing. People do want to farm. People are desperate to get on the land, desperate to grow fruit and veg. And I think, that there's real importance to emphasize amateur, local growing, gardening. People are getting more interested in that. And so there's a real need to amplify that. On the urban question, this is implied in what I was saying earlier. Farming, human life is energized by the sun, but the sun's energy is diffuse, and the consequence of that historically is that people have been diffuse. The reason that we have all these huge cities, New York, London, Paris, is basically because of fossil fuels that enable us, as I was saying at the outset, to break out of that historical pattern. And there's no, I get into trouble for saying this, but there's no real easy way of saying it. I don't see the degree of modern urbanism that we have now as surviving in the post-fossil fuel age. The quicker we embrace that, the better, really. But there are communities in big cities. I lived in London for a while and was part of a great little community. There are opportunities for producing food, certainly not all of your food. In the global south, much more so. Interesting work that people like Jim Thomas of the ETC group have been doing, that there are significant amounts of food being produced in big cities in the global south, and it's, partly, I suppose, a squeamishness in the global north about, not having chickens and cows and higgledy-piggledy vegetables in cities. But ultimately, I think, we are in for deurbanization globally, and the quicker we embrace that and politically, the less chaotic it's going to be. But yeah, they are big structural problems, and we need to address them as quickly as we can.
That's an interesting point of view. Lots of people.
Can I please deeply disagree with what has just been said?
I disagree too, actually. I was wondering whether to say that. Thank you.
I feel so strongly. Look, for most of the world, the city is the place of hope. Don't kid yourself. The country, the view of the countryside, which we've just heard, is both historically and presently just not true. People live excruciatingly poor lives in the countryside, and they look at the city and they see that as a place of hope. Now, the cities themselves, of course, have never provided what people hoped they would. Don't think that there is a perfection in some kind of country return to the country. The reason the people left the countryside was that it was an appalling place to live.
No, that's not what I said.
We have a view of that, which is, I think, entirely romantic. Now, I say that as a small farmer who grows my own vegetables in my own garden. I believe in all that. But I believe in accepting that with the population we have to make the cities great places to live. And therefore, when the good lady in the front row says we have no communities, that's not true. We have a community even in the centre of Westminster. We know each other, we help each other, we have an association which makes it possible to do so. We have an indomitable woman who runs it and keeps us in order. That is true throughout London. There are villages in London, and what we need to do is to reinvigorate what is really there and really make those communities just the sort of communities which of course will have some agriculture about them, where there are gardens, where there are bees on roofs. There are all sorts of things that we can do. But again, we do all those things and we accept that the world isn't going to move to some idealized view of the countryside, which frankly has never existed. And for the vast majority of people, certainly doesn't exist today.
You're going to give you 1 minute to come back at that, and then I'm coming to the next question.
Well, yeah, just quickly, I mean, it was not an idealised view of the countryside. It's about energy futures. It's about, it depends on your view of energy futures. If you think that we can decarbonise the energy supply at more or less existing levels of price and abundance, then for sure the future will be urban. But, if you're going to sustain urbanism, you need an enormous energy supply to keep cities ticking over. But secondly, it's not about an idealised vision of the countryside, but, there are long histories of enclosure, people being forced off the land, people being forced against their will into cities. So I think we need to get beyond the kind of cities are good, country is bad, or vice versa. There are complex histories across the world that that kind of transcend that kind of city good or city bad, rural good bad. That's not what it's about.
Okay, good answer. Gentleman there, can you just say who you are?
Thank you very much, Rosie. Christopher Stopes, Organic Farmers and Growers. And the first thing is, I don't want to enter this debate which Lord Deben referred to the lady in the front row as talking about communities and talking about cities. I think Chris Smaje got it right, and I think John Gummer got it wrong. The thing I wanted to ask, more importantly, is a question around geospatial targeting, a term which I hold dear, because I'd like to see the targeted space as the barren east of England. And the first thing Carl mentioned was the rewilded uplands. I think we need to be looking at the way in which the eastern counties have been dominated by conventional farming with perpetual arable rotations with a large input of pesticides and herbicides. So the question is, can we use geospatial targeting, Kyle, to encourage the conversion to an organic system? Because that then leads to my other question, which is, yes, there is a general pick and mix approach and we don't get clear what the system is. Why don't we use a system that is well described and well defined with many attributes and some flaws as well as organic and promote that? We need more people to say, as for example, Riverford does and many of the other people in the organic sector, organic is a good idea. So why don't you say it more? Because where it fits, it's a good fit. OF&G has done a land use scenario modelling looking at 10% or 25%, a modest suggestion. We're not suggesting taking over the world. So can we also encourage that? So
Carl,
may I,
take this one.
Yeah. The thing, thank you for the reminder. The one thing we haven't talked about in this session so far, which relates to this point, I think, is what's been referred to as the Wild West of some of these quasi-private carbon trading schemes. You've heard about this where emissions are offset through the planting of trees in places where that's encouraged by whoever owns the land. And why do I say that? Because I don't want to see those opportunities that you mentioned for what's right to do in East Anglia, organic farming, or farming that is suitable for that environment, that could assist with food security and protect the environment, be instead infiltrated with things that are not appropriate for that area. Some of these carbon trading schemes rely on non-native plantations of trees in the most god-awful places. Well, let's have a look and see which parts of the countries are best suited for certain things. And when I said before that this idea about rewilding in the uplands, I didn't mean to say that places like East Anglia should remain and be intensified as arable deserts filled with pesticides and high levels of fertilizer use. What I'm saying is there should be, as far as I'm concerned at Client Earth, is that there should be a vision for a regulatory baseline, which we discussed before, that protects the whole of the country for environmental and climate purposes. And then on top of that, building a geospatial approach that softly guides through financial incentives, the right things to the right places. And that means farming and biodiversity and climate mitigation in East Anglia, but just as appropriate to that region.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Guy Watson. Sorry, I'll come to the back of the room next. Then we'll come to the balcony. Then we'll come to the online ones, and we'll run out of time.
Guy Watson of Riverford Organic Farmers. Though I fully support the idea of a land use framework plan, I really, and this may be a Devon-centric view, but I recently dug a 600-metre trench across the farm to lay an irrigation pipe. The soil changed every 10 metres. The topography changes, the exposure changes. I am somewhat fearful, though I'm fully signed up to the idea that farming needs regulation and we do need a plan. I am somewhat fearful of a bureaucrat coming and telling me the best use of what is an incredibly complex landscape and lends itself to an incredibly complex land use. I'm just a bit concerned about how bureaucracy will manage that. There may be less of a problem in the east of England, but particularly in the west of England, I see that as being very difficult, and I hope that we end up with a system that is enabled to harness the knowledge of farmers and land users locally and build it into that plan rather than something that's imposed from above. Thanks.
Okay. Seems to me that that makes a great deal of sense. Let's take another point. Yeah, someone down. Yeah. Can you stand up? Okay, we need better volume.
Thank you. My name is Megan Sherwood. I work for a small family foundation that focuses on agroecological funding. My question for you is just around how, by meeting UK requirements for net zero, that we don't necessarily push that responsibility onto offshore places. How do we make sure we're insetting our carbon rather than continuing to do it as we are at the moment?
John, do you want to pick that up? I mean, presumably you're talking about the Scope 3 emissions of all the stuff that we grow in other places that we don't count. I mean, that seems to be just a scandal on a worldwide basis that favours the rich over the poor countries.
Well, that is a very true statement. And indeed, the problem we all have to face is that it is the rich in all countries, not just in the rich countries, who create the vast majority of the emissions that we make. And yet the system makes it easier for them to avoid all the things we're talking about. And I speak as an organic farmer in East Anglia, by the way, and actually we're changing what's going on almost voluntarily. It's amazing how the changes have taken place already, and they're well on the way. And I think we should be encouraged. I entirely agree with the comment that we don't want a lot of bureaucrats telling us exactly what to do, but we need them to enable us to do what we need to do. But we also need a very much bigger look at the way in which we distort the world's economy because of the very rich. I, for example, think that this government should have put a very large tax on private flying of aeroplanes for business or leisure reasons. Instead of that, they've been encouraging the expansion, for example, of Farnborough, so that we'll have even more of them. And so one of the things we have to do is to recognise that those who create most emissions should in fact pay a proper price, maybe over the proper price, in order to make sure that the rest of the world can operate more sanely, sensibly, and environmentally. At the same time, we need to be much better at reminding ourselves of the consumption figures, which is the point this questioner brings forward. we have to reduce our own production figures because those are the figures we have direct control over. But thank goodness the world has changed now, so those category 3 emissions, the emissions we create somewhere else, are becoming more and more important. And that's why this government needs to get on with imposing the rules which we need to have for companies to report on their category 3 emissions and to work hard on reducing those as well as the direct ones of which we speak.
Thank you. Anyone up on the balcony who... No, which I can't see. So come to the lady down the corridor in the green.
Hi, my name's Emily Howgate and I'm an independent sustainability consultant. And we heard about the missing middle, and I'm thinking about the opportunities in our seascapes as well as our landscapes. I wonder if the panel could speak a little bit about the opportunity to connect with the missing marine in terms of the food and climate opportunities that regenerative aquaculture as well as land-based regenerative agriculture hold with shellfish and seaweed, and opportunities to connect the policy and infrastructure for benefits there.
Thank you for the question. Who wants to answer that? Deafening silence.
Well, I can say I think that something I've been interested in looking at. I'm not sure where it's gotten to in government, if anywhere, but I think the Fisheries Act, the post-Brexit Fisheries Act 2020, I think it is, permits for the government to provide subsidies in the marine area, which would be analogous perhaps to what's going on land with the ELM scheme. So that would be worth looking at because the incentives could be targeted to certain things in the marine area. But I don't know too much about what's happened on that front.
Well, I know that we have done the 30 by 30 protection of the seas, but it's still not that good, and there is still bottom dredging going on in supposedly MPA's, marine protected areas. John, is that anything that you would like to comment on?
Well, it is a very simple measure which would prove whether the government was serious about it. And that is exactly what you say, the banning of bottom trawling altogether. We shouldn't be bottom trawling, it's unacceptable. But we actually had to take an NGO of which I'm a trustee and therefore I declare an interest. We had to take the government to court to stop it allowing bottom trawling even in marine protected areas. It's only after they were taken to court that they actually changed those rules. But it is quite unacceptable. It shouldn't be done, and we should be banning that, and at the same time extending the creation of seagrass and kelp areas, because they are the things which will return the sea to being a much better sequestrator of carbon.
And what do you think about the idea of charging worldwide shipping a tax for using the sea, which could then be put into marine protection, which I know groups like Oceana in America are looking at trying to get into international law? Seemed to me like a really good idea, but it then made people think about what fuel they were using.
Well, I think that it's maybe a good idea, but it isn't the first idea, because the first idea is to make sure that the standards which are applied to shipping stop ships doing the things they do at the moment, which is to use the worst of fuel, create the greatest amount of NOx, create enormous waste because of what they put overboard. There is much more to be done to get the shipping industry itself to have proper standards. And they are being led by some of the best companies like Maersk, who are really trying to do something about it, but they suffer because we don't have international standards. So the bucket shops constantly undercut the others. I don't think that the taxing them to use the sea is the first priority. The first priority is setting standards for shipping, which would have to be met. And that will be led, I think, first of all, by big business, decent companies, saying we're not going to use shipping which doesn't meet the standards which are laid down.
If I could just say something really quick on this topic.
Yep.
The parallels on land and sea are unsettlingly similar. Big business leading intensive poultry production, let's say, in the Wye Valley on the border of England and Wales, with all of the detrimental effects that has on water and air and climate, can be compared to the detrimental effects of salmon farming in Scotland. And what do both systems have in common? Multiple jurisdictions in charge of multiple regulations that are all very complex, and a lack of a joined-up approach in both cases.
Right. Okay. Is there anything that online? No. Okay. Okay. Over to this side because we've been very neglectful. The gentleman here. Hi.
Thank you very much. If I remember rightly, the goal of this particular session was to talk about the role of agriculture, and so I'd like to come back to that specific question, the role of agriculture. And I put 4 things to you. First of all, that we need to, if you want to achieve something, you have to know what you want to achieve. So what is the role? 1, is it not that agriculture should become net a sink? It's not, it has to go beyond net zero. If we are to be net zero as a civilization, it has to be a sink. Therefore, number 1, the role of agriculture itself is to become a sink. That's my proposition number 1 for your consideration. 2, that it has to become ecological in that sense. It has to work with nature, and that in order for that to happen, it has to become ecological. Point number 3, in order for that to also work, it has a fundamental role in educating the food system and the food appetites and the food understanding to make people food literate as to what is healthy food. And that agriculture has a role in making that happen, and the reverse would be what we do on the land. And finally, that will only happen if we actually create a literacy in understanding. And that means that policyholders at national and local government levels must become educated. I'm quite appalled at the absence of real expertise about land at that level, and that needs to start with children and all the way up. So therefore we need to fundamental education. How does that stand as a role?
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I mean, I suppose the only thing I might say, the first one, I think, in terms of agriculture being a sink, I think that, there's a slight danger with that in that, I mean, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I think we need to have low energy local food systems. I mean, that, the real problem, the real driver of this is fossil energy, and that's what prevents us from having ecological local food systems. So I think that agriculture as a sink is a great idea, and we can, so stuff Kyle was talking about in terms of soils, sort of agroforestry, it kind of falls into place if you permit local communities to take charge of food production, if you kind of get the, get the kind of fossil fuel destruction of localism out of the way. But I have a slight question about the carbon counting involved in worrying overly about whether we're leaving, using organic manure or straw left on, on post-harvest and so on. I think it's better to focus on the local food systems and the way that fossil energy kind of prevents agriculture from being ecological. But in the long term, yeah, great. If it's a sink, so much the better.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question. The lady right at the back there. And we'll bring everybody in on.
Hi, I'm Alana Weston. I'm a philanthropist and I have a farm in Wales. Can you tell me what you think the role of philanthropy is in this systems change or systems improvement? We've talked a lot about government, but I'd like to know how philanthropy can agitate for change or help with innovation.
I mean, I guess my take on that, I keep coming back to this notion of local food systems. My take on that is that people, there's a lot of people who have modest to high levels of wealth who are living somewhere and caring about their community. We need to kind of decommodify land, make it available for good local land use and food production. So there's an enormous role for people who are in possession of some capital or philanthropists to make land available, to decommodify it, to set up land trusts. There's endless models that we could talk about all day, but using in a sense, using what's often the kind of private wealth that's pooled locally in a community for local community needs to make that more widely available. I mean, that, to my mind, is a real key thing that we need to mobilise people who care, who are local, with resources to move towards local community-based food systems.
There's great untapped potential, I think, in foundations and philanthropists working in conjunction with NGOs, particularly in this country, because of fortunately, the open, transparent sort of access that we have to try to influence government. And there's so much recent convergence of NGOs around this topic, which range from advising on legal principles, which is bringing legal challenges, which is Glyner's role, all the way through to other organizations that focus on science or policy, and also link up what we're doing here to the global picture. So I would say there's tremendous opportunity there. Individual NGOs have been obviously supported in the past quite wonderfully, but this sort of continual networking and building up of skills across many NGOs working in partnership, I think that's a great new frontier of influence. So I would say finding those networks and working with them.
John.
Well, first, I agree entirely about the locality area, so I end with an agreement on that subject. I think there's so much that one can do locally to recreate the local community and to see that it really is a means of harnessing all those strengths and abilities and skills that you have locally. So if we're talking about philanthropy, I think philanthropy really does start at home. What are you doing about the community in which the philanthropist, small or large, is actually living? But the second thing is, I think the real priority is the one that Kyle has just mentioned. I think that anybody who has got the means should be helping the battle to bring to the public the truth about all these issues. I think the biggest problem we've got is that there's so much that's hidden. And philanthropy to create transparency is, I think, absolutely central. So it's whether supporting Client Earth or organizations like that use the courts in order to show up where things are going wrong, or it is the investigative journalists and the others who are opening the world's eyes to some of the appalling things that go on, which are making it more and more difficult for us to look after our environment. So I think the priority is creating transparency, and it's only the independence of philanthropists that can achieve that.
I hope you got an answer. I'm afraid that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all for listening at home. And a huge thank you to Chris and to Kyle and to John joining us from East Anglia. I guess you're going to be taking your tree down today. It's very pretty and it's nice to see it. So thank you all very, very much indeed. Thank you, guys.